OJ Rose, and today we're going to be talking about section 12 of Belonging Again. And we've talked a lot about Jonathan Rout's, Conyers, the way that tolerance dissolves the boundaries and givens of societies. And there's a great book by Dr. Hunter called Evangelism, and I think that was written in the 80s or the 90s, where he went through and he sort of examined how evangelicals dealt with modernity, how they ideologically made themselves fit, but at the same time convinced themselves that they didn't betray their core beliefs, and arguably they didn't. And it's an interesting book that goes through the ways that people deal with being surrounded by ideas that make them question what they believe and how they make it all fit together. And there's a man named Walter Lippmann. He talks a bit about how human beings can't really function if their life feels terribly, intolerably disjointed. They need to feel like their work and their education and their family and their civic duties and their government, they don't have to go together perfectly, but they need to go together well enough. Because if it all feels intolerably disjointed, then people get anxious, they get unhappy, and that can lead to political and social ramifications. But the moments, and so, there's this kind of quiet certainty that people enjoy, that they like to live in, where they just kind of know that how they think is how the world works, whether they're right or not. And they just kind of, their core beliefs are something they can just hold and not really think a lot about. But the moment you have symbolic boundaries and givens and things like that destabilized, then a lot of the big, deep philosophical questions come up. If Genesis is not literal, for example, well then what else in the Bible might not be true? What else could be metaphor as opposed to literal? And so a lot of questions open up. Just a simple concession perhaps to modernity that evolution might be true is not simple at all, because it opens up a lot of questions. And if the Bible can be, if not wrong, vague on that subject, then what about marriage? What about gay marriage? What about all these other things? And you start to, the quiet certainty quickly goes away, and you have to start asking a lot of questions. And really what ends up happening in pluralism, and it's not just with evangelicals, everyone's givens are destabilized, and that gets into Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, where it's not just believers who feel destabilized, but even people that don't believe, they're haunted by the sense that there might be something out there. And James K. Smith talks a lot about the work of Wallace, David Foster Wallace, in that way. But anyway, there are these acids of modernity that eat away at the quiet certainty that people have. And they're kind of put in a position where they're forced to be philosophers, where they're forced to ask big questions. And who has time for that? If you've got a job, if you've got a family, if you've got all this different work, and you're forced to kind of ask the big, deep philosophical questions that arguably even the greatest minds who have all the time in the world have not been able to figure out, then you're going to have a lot of questions that you're not going to be able to address. And the fact that you can't address them might eat at you and might destabilize you. And you're going to be forced to still vote, forced to still participate when you're no longer sure how you should participate. There's another paper called The Grand Technology, where I argue our experience of terrors and traumas and hardships in the world personalized as opposed to just information similarly puts us in an existentially angst situation. So we exist and live today with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of noisy uncertainty, and we really want to have our lives feel connected and jointed, not disjointed. But in order to do that, we have to kind of enter into a lot of philosophical thinking, of which we may not be equipped to do, or frankly have the time to do it, and yet we find ourselves, because givens are being destabilized, with our whole field of consciousness trembling with uncertainties, as Walter Lippmann put it. In this situation, when we feel this way and we want belonging, and I would also argue that the anxiety all this creates is one of the reasons we don't feel like we belong. This is unfortunately the condition in which totalitarianism becomes very appealing, a recurring theme of this, and yet it is now a inescapable dimension of our lives today. It creates more freedom. When you have quiet uncertainty, and there's lots of quiet uncertainty that's bad, right? Like if you're quietly certain that white people are better than black people, or that, that you're the special people that know the truth and nobody else does, well, it's good to have this quiet certainty destabilized, because it perpetuates evil and discrimination and contributes to that banality of evil we keep talking about. But if you don't have any quiet certainty at all, then life is very noisy. Although for some, that could be exciting. If we get into thinking like Gilles Deleuze, that's the condition by which you can have true societal evolution outside of ontohistoric repetitions, as I like to call them. But it's a very tall order for the average person to deal with. And if the average person still has to go to work, they still have to somehow take care of their responsibilities, it's really to throw a lot on their plate. But if the average person can't handle it, or, is in a situation where they're forced to figure out how to handle it, but they don't have the tools, then they might turn to totalitarianism rather from the conservative or from the liberal side, or they might turn to desperate action. So anyway, that's section 12. We'll continue with 13, and this is OG Rose. You can find more at ogrose.com. Thank you for your time.